This is the first of what we're calling the Lebanon series, where we'll be hearing from different Lebanese creatives, and we'll also be talking about different causes and ways to help in Lebanon. Today, we'll hear from Serge Majdelani on the issue of migrant workers in Lebanon.
Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be here and a pleasure to present the work we're doing. The issue of migrant workers has been on my mind for a very long time because growing up in Lebanon, I would see it everywhere, and I found it weird to have these people live amongst us and have very different standards of living and be treated very differently. And it's all because of this kafala system that is in place and how you have workers that come here and are sponsored and under the responsibility of others as if they were a pet or an object. And it leads to situations when if a worker is mistreated and wants to run away, their passport is taken away and they end up on the streets and and when they run away, the law is set in a way that it is in the employer's interest to right away report her and complain about him or her, apologies. So right away you have these workers that now are stuck on Lebanese territory, not able to leave because the worker put in a complaint. So they can't just leave the country. If they try to leave at any port or airport, they're right away detained and go to jail. And very often these employers end up saying that, and they're pushed by Amn al-Am or the local authorities to even say that either they stole something or they did something that's bad. So they end up having these complaints and could lead to actual jail time and then being forced to repay. Sometimes it is the case. Sometimes, most of the time, it's not the case that they've stolen anything. So it's a very difficult situation. And since the economic downturn and the collapse of the economy in Lebanon, these workers were paid before in dollars that they would send back home. Today, they're not paid in dollars anymore. They're paid in Lebanese pounds, and they're unable to send that money home to their families to support them. So they end up running away because of that, or because sometimes we've seen on social media and a lot of reports where the employers are just throwing them out on the street because they can't pay them anymore. You have these workers, so they get thrown out on the streets, and then there's a complaint lodged against them with the authorities. So they're not having an income, they're not supporting their families, and they find themselves on the street unable to leave. So that's why we've been seeing a growing number of Kenyans, Cameroonians, Ethiopians. There's the nationality. There's at least 12 to 15 nationalities where you have these people living on the street in unbearable conditions, struggling to find food, being harassed by people walking on the streets, by men trying to harass women that have babies, trying to get them to prostitute themselves. I'm taking extreme cases, but those are cases that are happening, and it's situations that shouldn't happen. And if us as Lebanese are bringing these migrant workers to help them get a better life, we shouldn't toss them out on the street. So the initiative I took is, after the blast, I tried to help out with Lebanese, but I saw that all the NGOs for the Lebanese causes are very organized and have a lot of money. And then I saw these workers not getting the help they need. So I felt that I would get a bigger impact. And I connected with a group of 4 or 5 of us. They were feeding them every day and sending them baby supplies and other types of supplies for them to have some sort of decency while they're sleeping on the streets. I thought that feeding them and giving them supplies is great, but it doesn't solve the problem. I decided to, in their collaboration, to launch this GoFundMe page to raise the funds to actually be able to send them home, so that we don't have the issue of feeding them forever. It's actually, let's get them reunited with their families. And the difficulty there is, it's not as easy as just buying them an airplane ticket and having them go. You have these complaints that make the Lebanese authorities not let them go. So we've been spending time with the embassies, with these workers, trying to document them, understand who has a passport, who doesn't. Most of them don't. And then contacting the employers and trying to bargain with them, telling them we have lawyers, we're going to go out to social media and go to the public and go to the media and tell them, and showcase their situation so that they will embarrass the employers. So we've been trying to use that tactic in order to get the employers to release their claim on the workers, so that the Amn al-Am and the local authorities allow them to leave. And after that, you start asking you need the Kenyan authorities or the Sudanese authorities, whatever country we're dealing with, to allow them to enter on the other side. We need the Lebanese to let them leave. We need to buy them airfare. We need to get them PCR test administered. We were lucky to find a couple of labs that are willing to provide free PCR tests. It's not going to be the case for the hundreds of workers that are out there, but we're trying to focus on let's get a first group of 50, 60 workers to go home. We as a group decided the Kenyans' conditions were one of the worst, so we're focusing on them as a first base, but they're by far not the only ones that need our help. So we're estimating about $400 or $500 per person. What we're using the money for is literally, we've been trying to find a shelter in place. It's been very difficult because there's a large number of these workers. So try to find a shelter to shelter them, figure out their paperwork to leave, administer PCR tests, figure out the logistics for them to get to their villages. Sometimes they need to take buses for several hours to get back to their families, and also pay for the airfare and figure that out. So that's been what we've been working on, all while every day, a lot of us work with Muwatin Lebanese, Artciel, and all these NGOs in Lebanon. But we go home, we go to these NGOs, we help them a bit, but we also take food and supplies from them, and also from people that are willing and contacting us. We've been lucky and very grateful for all the donors and generous people that have been contacting us since we launched the GoFundMe as well, to send us suitcases, baby supplies, and so on. So we've been getting those to these workers on a daily basis, and even on the weekends when the embassies and the authorities are not working. So our next step is really hoping to, beyond the day-to-day, is get them home.
Thank you so much to Lara Atallah for having me here, and for Lara Atallah for allowing me to introduce her. Lara and I met was many years ago, about 6-7 years ago, when I used to work at a gallery in Chelsea, and Lara would come. This was when you were writing still, in addition to creating your own work, and I got to know you in that way, and you're an amazing writer as well as an amazing photographer and an artist, and it's really nice to have seen, and sort of throughout the years, how your practice has evolved and shifted and changed, and where you've come to today, and obviously you will continue growing, but it's really nice to have these, you know, long-standing relationships that you've in New York, where people are always moving and leaving, and so I feel really lucky to have you as a friend and as a colleague, and and I will go into your official bio now. Based artist and writer. Her practice is informed by her interest in the political nature of landscape and the power it holds to reshape our perception of borders. Her work has been exhibited in the US and internationally, and is part of the Onassis Cultural Foundation collection in Athens, as well as the NYU Langone Art Collection. Recent exhibitions include the American University Museum, Trestle Gallery, and on CANAL in New York. Her first book, Edge of Elysium, Volume 1, was published by Open Projects Press in September 2019, and it's a beautiful publication. I encourage everyone to check it out or purchase it. Her writing has appeared in Artforum, Camera Austria, Flash Art Italia, and the Brooklyn Rail, among others. And with that, Lara Atallah, I hand it to you to begin your presentation.
Well, thank you, Lara. Thank you, Lila, and thank you, Serge. Thank you all for being here, everybody who's attending. So, as Lila was saying in her introduction, my practice is informed by my interest in the political nature of landscape and the power it holds to reshape our perception of borders. But what I'm doing today is I'm going to walk through about 7 years of practice, because the truth is, I didn't start with that 7 years ago. As I was building my practice, things were coming together little bit by little bit, until I finally arrived a few years ago to sort of like synthesizing what my interests are and delving more into them. So what we're looking at right now is like an early work from 2013, in which the first border that I wanted to challenge was the border of the photographic medium. What you're seeing on your screen right now is a photograph made on medium format film that exposes about 30 pictures overimposed on each other of the same location from different angles, on the same piece of film. And what I wanted to do with that was challenge this idea of that a photograph can only be like this one moment captured, like an instant captured in time. Yes, that can certainly be what a photograph is, but a photograph can be so much more than that. And I think if I really think about it, the fact that I'm a contrarian is probably what informs most of what I do. And this was sort of like the beginning of that. So what you're looking at right now is like this view at 9 a.m., 30 pictures on top of each other. The same view 3 hours later, 12 p.m., noon, 3 p.m., and 6 p.m. And the whole idea of that was to track the movement of time and space and to keep it sort of like, to see what would happen if these were all to exist in one similar frame. As time moved on, also still at the beginning of my practice, I was still freshly in New York, freshly immigrated, I had freshly left Lebanon, and I was starting to realize how my feelings towards where I was from was starting to shift. I was starting to feel a growing estrangement. The fact that I went from living there continuously for like 22 years plus to visiting once a year started to shift the way that I would interact with my surroundings when I went there to visit every year. And so in order to better understand my changing relationship to that place, I started just documenting my trips back. And that sort of helped me assess both my estrangement and the feeling like I'm no longer, I kind of belong to neither place that I'm in, whether the place that I live or the place that I'm from, and sort of like how it feels to sort of revisit these places and see them with different eyes. In parallel, something that I feel like has reemerged. I was fascinated for a certain time with how photographs help us shape historical narratives. And this idea of like being from a culture that praises nostalgia in a way that others might not. And I started looking into what this obsession, I guess, to a degree with nostalgia was. And interestingly enough, in my research, I discovered that nostalgia, when the word first appeared in our lexicon, was not used the same way we use it today. Nostalgia was actually the word that described a physical disease with physical manifestation, which we today have come to know as PTSD. So I thought it was interesting how PTSD a couple of centuries ago was actually described using the word nostalgia, like a sickness that makes you relive certain events of your life. And I started thinking of that in the context of Lebanese, in the context of being from Lebanon, being from the Levant in general, and how there's constantly this tendency to want to look back on certain days and to find solace in the idea that the past was better because there's not much of a present or a future to hold on to. I promise we're not going to stay bleak for the entire presentation, but I just had to touch on that. And so as I was like thinking of that, especially coming from my background as someone who was born at the end of the Civil War and who hasn't really lived it, I started thinking about the ways in which we inherit our parents' traumas and we inherit our parents' nostalgia, and their narratives become our narratives. And this idea of like vicarious memories and how photographs sort of help channel that. All of this to sort of like explain what you're looking at here, which is basically this constructed scenery that is pieced together from different archival images from the 60s and 70s. I basically took what is known as like the golden age of Lebanon, which is like 1960s to 1975-ish, right before the war broke out, and reconstructed scenes and sort of paired them, like wanted to show the setup as like a construction and paired it with this display of foods as like the only tangible thing that you have that you can't, like that ties you to your culture no matter where you go. So you can recreate narratives using pictures, you can reconstruct and manipulate pictures. But what I found interesting is that wherever you go in terms of like cuisine, it is the one tangible thing that you carry with you wherever you go. It is like, there was something more real and corporeal about it than reconstructed narratives and manufactured memories. And so this is where like the border of like breaking narratives started to form in my head before we started like, as I started delving deeper and deeper into this practice. Still within that idea, I was reflecting, again, like so many images were going around on different platforms and different Tumblrs and different, like social media accounts sharing these images. And I started like a database where I was basically collecting them. And I thought about like how much projection was being done on these images, like this idea like of wanting to sustain hope, through remembrance, and like longing for a place that may or may not have ever been the way that you remember it. I created this sort of like 35mm slide projection based from the slides that you're seeing right now, in which I would like distort the image by obstructing pieces of it to sort of like mimic the way human memory works. So like whenever you revisit a memory in your head, even if you remember what happened at that time, whenever you start to retell a story, you always alter it over and over and over again. And this is kind of like what this installation was doing. It was just circulating images over and over and over again, but each time the image would appear, something about it would change. So this is probably the first project that really got me interested in challenging the idea of physical and geographical man-made borders. As I started going back to Lebanon, every year, at some point I developed this sort of tradition with a friend where every year we would drive down to the south, to like the border between Lebanon and Palestine. And I started developing this interesting obsession with wanting to photograph the blue line, and sort of wanting to represent two countries in one frame as a sort of like way of trying to comprehend what this fictional line is doing, and what happens when you draw a man-made border and decide that people who live on one side will get to have a certain fate and a certain destiny, quote unquote, and people who live on another will get to have another type of fate, destiny, access, freedom of movement, what have you. And a lot of this stems from the growing frustration of like driving down to the very southernmost point in Naura and like finding that there's a physical point where you literally, there's a barrier that does not allow you to cross over. However, the road itself goes on. The road itself, which predates these borders by hundreds of years, carries on as normal. And there was like this growing frustration of just wanting to like break this barrier and keep driving. And so my remedy was to sort of like photograph that borderland as I started wondering. So like this is actually the blue line, and what you're seeing here is Palestine, but from Lebanon. In 2016, which is where this idea of like wanting to push geographical borders really crystallized, and I felt like this is actually the essence of what I do and what I'm about. I came across my Polaroid camera, which I hadn't used since I was literally a child. It was the first camera that I had ever gotten in my life. And I got curious about finding out whether that camera still works. To my surprise, I went down to the beach, which is where I used to stay when I went to Lebanon. And I turned it on, I pressed it, and lo and behold, a photograph comes out. So even after all these years, that camera still worked. For whatever reason, I felt the impulse as the photograph came out and it hadn't developed yet, and it was still, like in its underdeveloped stage. I squished it between my hands. I wanted to, the word that I like to use for it is I wanted to sort of traumatize the image. And the reason why I was thinking that is because I was contemplating, I was standing on this beautiful scenery. There's like beach and there's rocks, and it looks so peaceful and great. But at the same time, for context, the date was late 2016. And at the time, like a lot of things had happened. The US election had just happened. We were our headlines were being bombarded every other day with stories of, refugees drowning in the Mediterranean Sea, trying to cross from Turkey into the EU. There were those headlines every other day. And I was just thinking about how the sea, depending on who you are and where you're born, is either a place that you perceive as being a place of recreation and leisure, where you can just go and hang out and, like spend your summer and get a tan. Or for others, it is a mass graveyard. And this isn't just true of the current migration crisis. This has always been true of the Mediterranean Sea. Like it has a history that dates hundreds, if not thousands of years of people, of like imperial conquest, cultural exchange, but also, like asserting oppression from one people over the other. And I was interested in how that geography kept changing through the years and through the time. And the idea of like photographing shorelines across, South Europe, Southwest Asia, and then North Africa became like a concrete project that I really wanted to use. And what was even more interesting for me was to pick a medium, which is the Polaroid, that to me was mirroring the subject itself. Like, much like you can't control the sea, you can't also control the outcome of a Polaroid photograph. You can't, like, when you squash the photograph, you can't necessarily control what it's going to develop into. And even when you're framing it and taking it, you can have this approximation of what the outcome, what the composition is going to be to a degree, but you know, you can't control shutter speed, you can't control aperture. And it was this exercise in sort of letting go and embracing the chaos that I felt drawn to. But also I felt drawn to this idea of like something as uncontainable as the sea was somehow sectioned into borders. And that was something that I just couldn't compute at all. But more so what I couldn't compute is the degree to which we normalized it. Like, even in our speech and how we go about our lives, we talk about like, oh, you know, like if you're on Libyan's passport and you want to go to, let's say, Italy, oh yeah, I have to like apply for a Schengen visa. Whereas like if you're Italian, because you happen to be born in a different set of coordinates a few thousand miles away, you just pick up and go. Or like if you're a refugee, forget visas, forget everything. You either, if you're not granted access, you have to risk your life and get on a boat that is likely to kill you because nobody gave you access to the land. And that's where the idea of Edge of Elysium came together. And so what you're seeing now was like about 3 years of documenting these different shorelines across South Europe and Lebanon, so as Southwest Asia. And as these pictures started coming together, and so as I was also going around, again, this idea of like wanting to pick up something concrete from these places and keep it with me, kind of like echoing the idea of like food in the previous photo, I started picking up beach pebbles and exposing them to cyanotype, light sensitive paper, and sort of creating these weird x-rays of natural elements there. And it was just this weird idea of wanting to document and like keep record and track what is technically uncontainable, and wanting to like embody the reality of it and the degree to which it is far more divided and far more sectioned and far more exclusive than we might be tempted to think or fully grasp. And then as these images started coming together, I felt like I wanted, it didn't feel like enough to just photograph it, because as I went around these areas, I also started encountering people who had made the voyage across the sea, people who did get on boats, almost died, or lost people they knew. And that's where the idea of the book, Edge of Elysium, came together. And it basically is a book that encompasses not just photographs, but also small narratives, like, well, this is like a short one, but streams of consciousness that are inspired by the encounters made as I was going on this trip. And so shout out to Daniello and Open Project Press. They published this book in 2019, and voila. So when I started using Polaroids, I became even more interested with this idea of like using alternative processes, right? Like, I just wanted to find as many ways as possible to make an image, whether that required a camera or not, whether that required film or not. Like, what are ways to make marks, to like indulge in mark making, to create a photograph that isn't necessarily just picking up a camera with a lens and framing it and taking a picture. And so that's where the idea of Cyanotype came to be. And, you know, a lot of projects start with, oh, I found this back to Cyanotype, let's do weird stuff on it and see what happens. Pretty much what I did, I started making these exposures with sand on Cyanotype. I wanted to see what the imprint of sand from a certain place would give. And what was interesting at that moment is that whenever you expose something that is kind of has like these organic shapes that you can't contain, it automatically ends up representing the sky. So I thought there was an interesting relationship there between the earthly realm and sort of like the heavenly realm, quote unquote. And I started thinking about this connection of how the sky and the sea sort of mirror each other. And, you know, the being as I had just freshly been to like Greece and to Italy, I started thinking of the figure of Poseidon or Neptune, whichever you prefer. And the idea of creating these images that are a combination of exposing actual sand and then culling digital imagery of these different statues wherever they might be in the world came together into the series that you're seeing at this moment. And like seeing the different faces of like a divine god represented over this like very, like again, this representation of the ethereal and the real. getting into the NSFW part of this presentation, I was also, when we think of borders and when we think of imperialism and when we think of colonization, our instinct is to think of the colonization of land and resources and the plunder of material things. But the truth is colonization is a lot more insidious than that, and it goes far beyond just taking resources and taking over land. It is a process that is very complex in how it also manages to colonize people's bodies and people's minds. And I was interested in how the human body itself is a landscape and how you can use a photograph to represent body and territory as like different manifestation of the same thing. And that's where the idea of like further traumatizing the image by engaging in Polaroid emulsion lift. So basically what you're seeing here is like a Polaroid image that was completely shelled out of its case through the use of like hot water that caused it to separate and whatever, and then transferred onto watercolor paper. So this idea of traumatizing the image is still always there, always echoing the subject itself. And so I started photographing friends of mine who are all from nations that have been colonized at one point in history. And the challenge became finding these like compositions that sort of have enough ambiguity where you at first glance are not sure what you're looking at. There's like a bit of like hills and mountains and peaks, and then you realize that it's a human body, but it takes you like a couple of seconds to fully realize it. And that's where that series came in. Okay, so remember the days when we could travel? Good times. Last year, I was able to go to Japan, and I was interested, and the reason why I wanted to go there and why I went there is I was interested in the fact that Japan and New York are 13 hours away from each other, and yet somehow, more or less at the same time of year, they both, well, New York a little bit earlier, I think, no, New York later than Japan, cherry blossoms bloom for about 2 weeks, and then, you know, like it's cherry blossom season, it lasts 10 days, 2 weeks, whatever, and then it's done and no more until the following year. And I was interested in this idea that both these phenomena were happening on opposite sides of the earth, and I thought it would be interesting to see what would happen if you were to once again collapse time and space into one frame. So that's where the idea for this project came. And what you're seeing on the screen right now is the combination of 2 Polaroids, one taken in New York, one taken in Japan, of different cherry blossoms collapsed into one, and with a color scheme that recreates the sunrise and the sunset. So like each one recreates a different like color of that spectrum, and sort of signaling the passage of time as like a series. On this idea of time and on this idea of alternative processes and thinking of ways in which you can transcend boundaries, not just geographical ones, but also boundaries in terms of medium. As I was traveling, I started taking like mental note, like always taking picture of the sky wherever I was. And so I ended up with like an image bank of different skies from different countries. And what I was interested in is how the fact that wherever you go, the sky looks the same, but the world is so different. And in the spirit of wanting to break barriers and break boundaries and challenge geographical borders, I thought of, I had read this, I remember reading this line in a book on quantum mechanics that said time doesn't exist. And that emphasized the idea of time as a construct, and that in fact, you know, time in the universe is something that we perceive, but it's not actually real. And I remember having a conversation on WhatsApp with a friend in Berlin who was like, oh, let's catch up. What time should we have a call? And I said, do you want to have, he goes like, do you want to have a call at 3 p.m.? And I said, 3 p.m. your time or mine? And at that point, he said something that sort of like prompted a whole, you know, like going down a rabbit hole of thinking, where he goes like, oh yeah, I forgot that aside from being divided by geographical borders, we're also being divided by time zones. And that's something that I kept tripping on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And that's where all of these things came together to sort of create this body of work that you're seeing here. And what you're looking at are 3 canvases that represent 3 time zones, 9 skies. So it was like the exposure and overexposure using cyanotype of different skies on different canvases and different surfaces. So I was wondering like what would happen if you could, you know, like again, like collapse several time zones in several places and several times into one border. Does this stop being a photograph, or is that still a photograph? The fact that this is non-reproducible, does that take away its legitimacy as a photograph, or does that reinforce it, or does that expand the definition of what a photograph is? And this was like another iteration of that, where I started like exposures of different, you know, like different sands from different places layered together into these sculpture pieces. And in here, what you're seeing is like a combination of skies and sand exposures. So each canvas was like done over like a certain period of time. And like even the spots where you don't see any sand or you don't see any sky per se, like that's still a spot that is marking time based on like how long it was left in the sun. And this is another one. 2020, a year that will go down in the books. All of a sudden, you know, like we were all halted. Everybody was locked into place. There was no traveling, a lot of uncertainty, and, you know, very little means to produce anything based on like the rhythm that I was used to. And I, you know, like as anxiety set in, as quarantine started getting longer, and as like all this uncertainty surrounding what's going to happen to us, what's going to happen to the world, I started thinking about different landscapes. And the landscape that I was thinking about at that moment was the landscape of a person's minds. Like, how can you use scarcity to still depict a landscape? And that's where the idea of a camogram came together. And this is like really recent work. This is from like a couple of months ago. And those are basically, so what a camogram is when you take photo paper that's you're not supposed to expose to light. You expose it to light anyway. And then you like just throw a bunch of chemicals on it and then develop it, process it, and then you get an imprint of the damage that all this chemical has done to the paper. And I came to see these chemograms as representations of what my brain has looked like throughout 2020. It was like an interesting way to like map a different kind of landscape. And that is where I'm at right now.
Thank you so much, Lara Atallah, for that. And it's always great to see you narrate, you know, your body of work, and to hear the process of how one experimentation and one body of work then leads to. And I think what I love about your work is that it's always grounded in some sort of historical, geographical perspective, but actually it comes about through experimentation with the mediums that you're using at the time. And in a way, yeah, it's all about landscapes, be it of the mind, of the actual physical. And I wonder, how do you, or if you do, or just talk a little bit about how you reconcile the concept of a landscape in whatever shape it can take, and history and the context of history. And so you, and maybe just to be a little more detailed about sort of where I'm going with that. For example, if we're talking about the series, the Polaroid series of the Mediterranean Sea, you're looking at a border that you set the border as the Mediterranean Sea, which technically is not looked at as a geopolitical, it is, but we're thought of, or post-colonial, are all divided in a way where you came and you took it and you looked at the sea as a border and a region in itself. And sort of, so in other bodies of work, sort of how do you reconcile these two things, the context, the historical political context, and then the landscape that you're going towards?
I think what the main thing that has become clear to me over the years as I worked on this is the how quickly and how easily we come to normalize or accept things that are technically very fragile and transient as permanent structures, right? So like in the project that in the Mediterranean project, for instance, one thing that I was very insistent on was to title each piece after the city it was shot in. So like at no point throughout this project will you see the mention of Italy or Greece or Lebanon. You will see Palermo, you'll see Athens, you'll see Beirut, so on and so forth. And that is like a crucial point in that project, because the truth of the matter is we've normalized our entire life the world map as it is, but that world map has changed thousands of times, and it will change 1,000 more times, regardless of whether that happens in our lifetime or beyond our lifetime. And it was more important to me to highlight the city, because historically we've seen that the cities always outlive the borders of the nation state they find themselves in. So in a way, it was a way to like delegitimize the nation state as a concept and to strip it of its power. Like, it's true that these nation states have imposed certain rules and regulations on freedom of movement, who gets to access them, but it is incumbent on us whether we accept them or not. Like, the reason they're in place is because we've normalized them.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We have a question from Bashar. He's asking if you faced any difficulties at the border in terms of Palestine. What was that like?
Oh, I mean, like my strategy with these things is to just always play dumb. Like we were basically driving in the car, and my friend and I, and like because I'm Lebanese, I'm a Lebanese citizen. Like there's a point where you get in the south where you have to show ID before you let through, and that was easy peasy. Just show your ID and whatever, go through, and like smile to the army guy or whatever. And then once you get to the UN militarized area, in some cases you have to sneak it, and sometimes it's like the guys that are there just simply don't care. You definitely can't, like, it's a case-by-case case. You have a case-by-case situation where you have to assess how cavalier you want to get and how cavalier you can afford to get. But playing dumb always saves you in this situation.
A lot of different artists and photographers in Lebanon always talk about how it's really difficult to photograph in Lebanon, Walid Raed being one of them. Yeah.
It's very difficult, but I find that it is mostly difficult in densely populated areas like Beirut. It is actually pretty difficult. Everybody's up in your business and wants to know who you are, what you want, who your dad is, what your blood type is, what shoe size you wear, and all that. Versus like in more rural areas where people are less likely to get in your business, or if anything, just like look at you like, what's this weirdo doing? So I don't think that there's like a set guideline. A lot of this is intuitive.
Lara, can you talk a little bit about sort of the medium of photography? You keep experimenting, as well as to historical kind of weight of which you touched upon, the idea of nostalgia, the idea of trauma. And I mean, it's hard to talk about these things. Obviously, we're all aware of what's happening right now and what has just happened, and sort of how the medium itself also, why is that your medium of choice as well to discuss and to talk about these things as opposed to maybe something else?
So I missed the first part of it.
Oh, I'm so sorry. But basically, it's just I was asking about sort of the medium that you use, the medium of photography, and the experimentations that you do with this medium, and how it is, and what you're addressing with your work a lot of the times are very difficult and very heavy, loaded, emotional things such as nostalgia and trauma. Also, forgetting, right? The idea of memory, but also amnesia, and how we're seeing it right now. I mean, how can we talk about these things without talking about just a whole other new cycle of new trauma and a nostalgia for an era that was right before this, which precedes an era, so just to talk about that a little bit, and the use of the medium itself of photography.
I think so. The reason why I personally chose it when I started making these bodies of work is it was one way for me to deal with my own feelings of resentment or lack of understanding. It at the onset and still now to some degree, it was a very selfish process. I'm not gonna lie. It was a lot about processing how I felt about being from that place and what impact it's had on me. So I don't want to romanticize and just like build a false narrative of like, I'm doing this for other people. Honestly, a lot of this, when I started doing it, it was purely for myself, and to a degree it still is. I think I just like, I see.
For yourself, sorry, for yourself to help you deal with what you were going through, or for yourself just, okay.
Yeah. It was a way of like making sense of something that I wasn't able to make sense otherwise. You know, like I always say photography is a means to an end. You know, it's one of the ways in which you can process whatever's in your head. Like some people write, some people make films, some people photograph. And that was something that I felt very drawn to. And this idea of like, you know, working with compositions and colors was something that brought solace to me. And then beyond, like that was the starting point essentially. And then just beyond that, thinking of how photographs and photography in general help you sort of take a step back from the reality that you're photographing. Because you can, if I look at a photograph today in 2020 that I took in 2017 or 2016, my reading of it and my interpretation of it is going to be very different from the moment I took, from the moment, from like how I felt about it when it was taken. And I think what I appreciate about the medium is that it gives you a trace on which you can build and rebuild narratives and sort of keep track of how your thoughts have changed, even though the image itself hasn't changed. And I guess that was like my biggest draw to it.
And how, I mean, you've lived here since you know, you've been mostly based in New York while you've been making all this work. Have you felt that how do you feel like the audience here in the West, if they're not necessarily from the region, have they understood the complexity of sort of what we, I think, all completely understand immediately what you're referring to, but I guess I'm curious to know, or what some of the reactions were?
I feel like, so when I was in grad school, there was like the constant pressure of having to explain and over-explain and re-explain and write like statements that span 5-6 pages instead of just like your regular 3 lines of just setting things in context. And it's something that I realize a lot of people from that region have to do, this idea of constantly having to like handhold people who are not from the region into understanding what's going on. And, you know, like I've reached a point at this point where I'm just like sick of doing the emotional labor for these people. And I feel like if you don't get it, you know, you have this great device in your pocket that you can just open and Google. And if that's rude, then I guess I'm rude.
We have a few questions about the explosion in Lebanon and the aftermath, and I guess the identity of being Lebanese and being in a creative. And someone specifically also asked, how can we reconstruct what remains as creatives?
I don't know how much you should take me seriously with respect to that question, because I wasn't there for the explosion and I didn't live it. And whatever vicarious trauma I might have does not begin to compare to anyone who's had to survive something like this. So I feel like I would, whatever I say should be taken with like a grain of salt, generally, whether it's this or anything else, honestly. I really think this is going to vary a lot depending on like the degree of what you've experienced, whether you were there on the ground or not. I think it might be a little bit too early to think about that when it's so fresh still. I have the luxury of and the privilege of being very far away from it and to not living it on the ground. I do think that if anything, I feel that what we have experienced is something that was the culmination of a plan that was started as far back as 100 years ago when the Great State of Lebanon was declared. And I can go on a historical tangent if we have time for it. But basically, everything that we have gone through in the past 100 years is a direct result of the Sykes-Picot Accord, which has proceeded into sectioning, creating borders where there were none, and creating nation states based on colonial systems that sort of wrote our constitutions for us. And regardless of like us attaining physical independence from them, to whatever degree you want to call this independence, the seeds were already planted for this event to happen. So when we talk about identity in the aftermath of what remains, as Sarah says, I think it's probably time to reconsider how we have defined our identities in relation to what has essentially been a colonial construct. And that's where my thinking goes. But again, like this is coming from someone who has the luxury and the privilege to live far away. And I can't speak for people on the ground and how they're feeling and what their connection to their identity is at this moment in time.
Of course. We have a question from Reef. He's asking if you tend to work on a particular project or series at a time, or do you work on multiple projects at the same time?
No, I tend to have two things going at once usually. Yeah, I do like to have some variety happening. I feel like once you start thinking about a topic, there are so many ways to go about it that sometimes, you know, I start different threads. Some of them I follow through on, and some of them I just realize that they're not working and I drop.
Can I jump in with a follow-up?
Yeah, of course.
Also, like, do you find that the narrative for like particular series comes before the actual work starts, or does it sort of like evolve as you already like started exploring some area?
Oh yeah, never. I feel like the work starts and then the ideas come later. You know, like as I was explaining, like a lot of what I do starts with trying to see what happens if I, you know, do this or do that. Like, oh, what happens if I throw some chemicals in? Or like, what happens if I take a Polaroid photograph and squish it? And then once I see like what happens that first time, then I start to like branch out and get to like the subconscious reason as to why I felt inclined to do that. And that's where the narrative begins to form. But I feel like my personal way of thinking is to always do first, think later when it comes to these issues.
Yeah, that's super cool. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, Lara.
Hi,
I really
Sasha.
enjoyed hearing your entire presentation. And, you know, commentary is very difficult in limited times and in short verbal questions. But I was wondering throughout, you know, and then at the end, you seem to provide an alternative to the thoughts that were developing in my mind. I think you described your thinking, and then you showed us as you showed us the results, the images, the pictures, and then you said something at the end that the thinking comes after the pictures. And for me, looking at all the pictures, I saw two things going on at the same time. One that I think I care about, and we all care about most, is how beautiful they are. And I think the word beautiful is very unpopular. It's just like, oh, I'm making something silly and romantic and saccharine and icing on the cake. But in the end, it's the visual beauty that is amazing in your work. And there are two particular groups that I find visually outstanding. The very first one of the pictures from the window, that was an amazing set of 4 that you showed us. And I really like the body landscapes. But it's, you know, the thing I would love to dialogue with you sometime about is, you know, you talk about things that I would say make it sound like you're starting from a set of words. And so my question is, do you ever just start from a set of ideas about what is visually beautiful and you want to do that? Or do you feel you have to explore in some unknown way until you just stumble into something beautiful?
You know, I feel like that was probably what you've described was probably how I used to go about it when I used to like take, I guess, like quote unquote traditional photographs. Like whenever I'm holding a camera where you can do like have full control over the aperture, the shutter speed, whatever it is that makes an image. I feel like I had this line of thinking where I had to control it into beauty. Whereas when I started letting go of that idea and embracing kind of the chaos of like, I don't know what I'm gonna get now. That's sort of like, that was a different way of flowing with the unexpected and ending up with something beautiful, even though that's not necessarily what you were aiming for, or you weren't so concerned with that being the outcome, if that makes any sense. So I feel like I've seen the shift in that sense.
So instead of, you know, in a way, what you were describing as your first search for beauty was more like a verbal beginning of some historical idea of what is beauty, some other, maybe something professors gave you or museums or some ready-made outside you, whereas then you shifted to exploring and taking chances, and that's when you really stumble into something genuinely beautiful, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree, definitely.
Yeah.
But thank you so much, Samia.
except, you know, when you're describing borders and wanting to get over borders, it seems like, okay, that's part of your exploration, you know. But in the end, I judge them, and I imagine you too, and most people will judge them on what they see with their eyes. Anyway, thank you very much. It's very interesting.
Thank you so much for your comments, Samia.
I'd like to close with one question. What do you want people to take away from this conversation today?
I think like how I like to end things was to say that, you know, like in the context of this hellscape year, that a better world is possible. It's not as insanely unattainable as we think. It just takes everybody pulling their weight, and it doesn't have to be that way. It only has to be that way if we all agree that it has to be that way. So I think just like daring to imagine how things can be, and daring to talk about what may seem like an insane idea to as many people as you want, and sort of mobilizing people to work towards a vision that isn't either the lesser of two evils, or like, you know, the devil, you know, or all these catchphrases that we're constantly bombarded with in the media. Like, we don't have to settle for less than what we deserve, is kind of like the big takeaway from all of that.